Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And our first focus this week is on the Middle East, and in particular, that critical area along the Turkish-Syrian border. Everybody who has been listening to the program here for more than a couple of months has heard all about the Jarablus to Afrin corridor. That is to say, the 100 kilometers or 60 miles that stretch from the Euphrates, going westward towards the Mediterranean and getting over to that area north of Aleppo and the town of Afrin, which is the sort of the western edge of the Jarablus to Afrin corridor. And that is exactly what is at issue this week. That is to say, in the past couple of weeks, this year, the Kurdish YPG forces, and these are, in crude terms, the good guys in this entire thing, have been able to cross the Euphrates River well south of the Turkish border, out of range of the Turkish artillery, although not of Turkish combat planes. So there's now an attempt. You can see there's a tongue of land that stretches out west of the Euphrates. You can see this. I urge people, if you're going to listen to the program this week, you're going to need to get, you're going to need to get some maps. And we have the maps for you. They are on tarpley.net. And some of the maps are available in the briefing of today. That is to say, the 19th of February, Friday, when we're recording. And then we've also got a map which appears in the previous day, where you see this tongue of land very, very clearly going west of the Euphrates. So the Kurds had pushed across the Euphrates south of the Turkish border, out of range of the artillery. So it means more than 25, 30 miles. But then what we've seen is a joint attack of the Syrian Arab Army, the Kurds, and the Russian Air Force on this critical town of Azaz. So the war news from the Turkish-Syrian front is that the first or second largest, it varies by estimate, but one of the two largest cities in Syria is, of course, Aleppo. And Aleppo, big commercial and manufacturing center, is there. This has now been pretty much liberated from the terrorist rebels. And this includes a lot of those wonderful democratic moderate terrorists that we've heard so much about, right? The Free Syrian Army and the wonderful Nusra brigades and other killers, cutthroats, jihadis, fanatics, and so forth, insurrectionaries. 95% of them foreign, 95%, not from Syria, from someplace else. That's the Syrian opposition. 95% foreign mercenaries, fanatics, double agents, whatever they are. So Aleppo is now largely, although not completely, in the hands of the Syrian Arab Army. They are mopping it up, one might say. There's a mop-up action going on. So that's the story from Aleppo. This means that there's a flow of terrorist rebels back towards their privileged sanctuary in Turkey, whence they came. That's how they got there. Remember, a lot of these people had been in Libya. They were then airlifted and sea-lifted into Turkey. Alexandretta, I think, was one of the places. This is what Ambassador Stevens was doing. They then came down this highway from Azaz to Aleppo and essentially imposed 2 or 3 years of hell, of terrorism, on the large and relatively sophisticated city of Aleppo. They're now being driven out. So the question is, as President Assad said in a briefing which we published on Wednesday, the battle going on now is no longer for Aleppo, but it is for the road leading from Aleppo back into Turkey. And the critical junction there is Azaz. So it's one of those towns where some roads come together, and that becomes then a fulcrum of the world's strategic situation, a little bit like Gettysburg or someplace like this, or Douaumont in the First World War. So you see how it works. So it's Azaz, the city of Azaz. Now take a look. It's a sort of a tiny parrot's beak reaching down from Turkey, and then immediately on the other side, within 5 miles or so, you have Azaz. So there's a big effort by the positive forces, Kurds and also others with some Russian Air Force assistance, to try to capture Azaz. In that case, you pocket a whole bunch of terrorists who are otherwise going to come back and try to kill you from some other point of view, right? It's like what General Sherman said, right? If you have these people who insist on rebelling, well, then you got to eliminate them. So that's what's going on now with these wonderful moderate terrorists. So let's take a look at what has happened. The background is pretty much what I said. And remember, we're talking about this Jarablus, or sometimes written Jarabulus, but Jarablus. On this map, it's Jarabulus, but I think the preponderance of the spelling and the orthography goes for Jarablus to Efrin. And it can be Afrin, A-F-R-I-N, or E-F-R-I-N. That's the corridor that's got to be closed. So we've had efforts now on the eastern edge of the corridor and the western edge of the corridor to try to shut this down. Once it's shut down, the Syrian war will come pretty much to an end, except for some areas along the border, say with Jordan, or some smuggling in from Beirut, right? But this whole insurgency is stoked by foreigners. And, of course, this whole thing, the defeat of the rebels, we had reports from Thierry Masson months ago now that during the winter months, and that's where we still are, we're about 2/3 of the way through winter now, that there would be the partial collapse or total collapse of the rebel positions. And that became obvious in January. That's after about 3 months of Russian bombing, October, November, December, 3 months of bombing. By January, the situation of these terrorist rebels was desperate. That is, of course, when you begin hearing the humanitarian concerns. There has to be a ceasefire, the humanitarian situation, blah, blah, blah. This, of course, is the cynical praxis of these imperialists. We've seen it with the Tamil Tigers some years ago, that once the terrorist proxies of the Western NATO powers get into trouble, then it becomes a humanitarian necessity to save as many of the crazies as possible so that they can fight another day, so that they can terrorize other people on other fronts in other ways. So that is where we are now. So the hysteria of the Erdogan, written Erdogan but pronounced Erdogan, and Davutoglu clique, that clique is now hysterical because all of those terrorist proxies, their irregular forces, right, their fifth columns in northern Syria, they're being ground up. They're being smashed. And even the U.S. is doing some things on the on the east side, on the Iraqi side, so to speak, right? We followed all the events there. But principally, it's the Syrian Arab Army, the Russian Air Force, and these Kurds. Now, the Kurds are in a position of being supported by both Russia and the United States, depending on where they are. And we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. So the whole world is now looking at Azaz, a critical border crossing, right? In the same way that we had Kobane a couple of years ago. That was part of this inexorable Kurdish advance, slow but steady, to close the border crossings, cut the enemy supply line, wipe out the terrorists, let them wither on the vine. And hopefully, if they have some brains, they would surrender. But then again, maybe not. So we had this. We were interested in the speech given by, or the interview with Agence France Presse given by Assad last week, where he said that his goal is to reunite all of Syria under the legal government, which he is. That's who was recognized by the whole international community before this whole bloodbath started 5 years ago. Remember, it's the Saudis and the Turks shipping in terrorists to foment an artificial, not indigenous, not autochthonous civil war there in Syria, all over the place. Some coming from Jordan, from Lebanon, and the Syrians have been trying to close those border crossings as much as possible. Some funny things from Assad, where he says that Erdogan of Turkey is a fanatic who's living the Ottoman dream, a Muslim Brotherhood fanatic living the Ottoman imperial dream. That's Erdogan. That's your NATO ally, by the way. This is why NATO is not worth it if you're going to get a lunatic like this. So Assad is always adamant that Turkey and Saudi Arabia run the terrorists. That's absolutely beyond question. The goal of Syria is to complete the liberation of Aleppo by cutting the logistics supply line to Turkey so nobody can get out and no reinforcements can come in. Assad says the Russians have never put a strong on him to quit. Interesting. And he's scornful of Trump and points out that if we can wipe out terrorism in Syria, that will be a big defeat for Saudi Arabia, the main state sponsor of terrorism. Notice, not Iran, but Saudi Arabia, right? The pro-Western, wonderful people under King Salman. So that's the background. Now, this week, on Wednesday, we had this bomb going off in Ankara, Turkey. This has got to be one of the crudest, crassest, and most blatant false flag attacks of recent years. And, of course, we've seen some doozies. The problem here is that the event seems to be delivered on order. We have to assume it was delivered on order. We have the Turkish intelligence, MIT, not Massachusetts Institute of Technology, at least as far as we know, but the Turkish intelligence, MIT. So at the very moment when Erdogan and Davutoglu are freaking out hysterically beside themselves because of the collapse of their terrorist proxies in northern Syria, along comes this event which seems to be made to order to give them a pretext. And that is what the world is waiting on now. So it's in the military district, in the government district of Ankara, the capital, inland, right, in middle of the Anatolian Plateau. Ankara is there, so terrorists bring in a car bomb, I guess it is, and a suicide bomber, and they blow that up next to some Turkish army trucks. They kill about 30 people, maybe 3 or 4 times that, hospitalized, wounded, very serious matter. And the following day, yesterday, Thursday, we have Erdogan making a special dramatic address to the Turkish nation that he found out who did it, and it's a Syrian Kurd. It's somebody from the YPG. And the YPG, of course, that is the most capable of the Kurdish forces. It's politically the best. The YPG is much better than the PKK, and certainly way, way better than that Barzani, Talibani entity there in northern Iraq, right? That part of the Kurds. That's pretty much the oligarchical wing. So the further west you go, the more radical it gets, and the YPG is the western edge of the Kurdish community. So we would recommend more U.S. support for the Kurds, but Erdogan now claims that they are the perpetrators. So he says, we're going to punish them. And, of course, the Turks have stepped up their artillery shelling into northern Syria, and they've been hitting the PKK in all kinds of places, northern Iraq and wherever have you. So Russia has demanded a session of the United Nations Security Council to discuss the aggression coming from Turkey against northern Syria, right, which is illegal. That's international aggression. That's a threat to international peace and security. That should be condemned. Turkey should be condemned as an aggressor by the UN Security Council, and the U.S. should not veto that. The U.S. should vote for it, because that's a way to send a signal to Mad Dog Erdogan that this will not be allowed. Now, Erdogan has been becoming more and more insolent, issuing ultimata to the United States, saying in effect, hey, U.S., hey, Americans, I want you to drop those YPG Kurds because those are terrorists. Of course, the U.S. would say, no, they're not terrorists. They're the main force opposing ISIS. They have proved able to kick ISIS out of just about anywhere, especially if they get a little bit of air support. But no, says Erdogan, those are my enemies. I expect the United States to do something about them. What do you mean you expect? Who do you think you're talking to, Erdogan? No. Isn't there anybody in the Turkish army who remembers the past glory of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk? Because Erdogan is the opposite. Erdogan is the caliph of the Islamic State, and he is a fanatic, as President Assad said, he's a fanatic from the Muslim Brotherhood. So the UN Security Council should act on that. And if you're going to see that if the U.S. does not get involved in this, then the British and the French are going to step up, because that's the combination. Britain, France, Israel, and Turkey. Those are the bad guys in the current situation. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, Prime Minister Davutoglu of Turkey has been ranting and raving. Never, never, never. They shall not pass. He says the Kurds are never going to be allowed to take over Azaz. And he has taken some countermeasures. The countermeasures are a group of about 500 terrorists were allegedly taken out of various other places in northern Syria. They were brought into Turkey, onto Turkish territory, and then they were guided and shepherded by the MIT and the Turkish army to the border right by Azaz. And then these 500 terrorists were, they were advanced into northern Syria. Now this, if it's 500 terrorists all in a row, this should be a turkey shoot for the Russian Air Force, and they'd be doing the world a favor by removing some of these characters, since that's the only way to pacify them ultimately. And we're awaiting the result of that, right? That presumably happened in the night between Wednesday and Thursday. Here we have the Al Monitor, right? The Middle East Monitor. Turkey is launching heavy artillery fire at Syrian Democratic Forces. That would be YPG, part of it, in Azaz, towards Azaz, declaring that the objective is to stop the advances of the Kurdish People's Protection Units, YPG. On the second front, Turkey is allowing militants, pushing them, into Syria since the Syrian army cut off the Aleppo-Kilis corridor, the road north. So all kinds of threats from Davutoglu. He says, we'll know when to attack. Don't worry, we'll know when to attack. You'll get your answer. This interesting article here is why Turkey is losing hope in the Syrian border town of Azaz. Now, the other thing you have to bear in mind is over the previous days, we had multiple threats of a large ground invasion by the Turkish army with elements of Saudi Arabian military forces, especially the Saudi Air Force. Not content with imposing genocide in Yemen, the Dark Ages monarchy, the kingdom, has decided to send part of its Air Force to Incirlik Air Force Base. What a shame. Incirlik in southern Turkey, southern Anatolia, is a NATO air base. And supposedly, as of the end of July of last year, remember with Allen, the ISIS czar, this was fixed up, right, so that the Turks would allow the U.S. to use Incirlik for bombing runs against terrorists in northern Iraq and also in northern Syria. So the idea, though, is this very detailed article in the Monitor tells us, all kinds of ammunition is being made ready. The forces are being pushed across. And every little village here, just like, it's a little bit like Verdun in 1916, 100 years ago. Same story, right? Douaumont, all these different places. Now it's Zara, Baskoy, Nubel, and so forth. It's all in this corridor between Aleppo going north. The Turkmen Mountain. Tel Rifat has been liberated, in my view, by the Kurdish forces. So you get this whole idea that the terrorist position is collapsing, and this is immediately a defeat for Turkey. What are they going to do? The Turkish government is working hard, we read, to persuade the international coalition to agree to a ground operation that would risk a clash with Russian and Syrian forces. No way. But developments on the ground threaten to upset Turkey's game plan. Well, let's hope so. So there it is. Very, very dangerous, right? And these desperate Ancien Regime forces like the Saudis, right? The Dark Ages absolute monarchy, right? With beheadings and crucifixions and all the rest. You can't expect them, right? King Salman, look at this guy. He lives in the medieval or Dark Ages dream world. Those guys are capable of just about anything. Now, I would also have to point out, right, the U.S. television networks and the principal newspapers. This is now absolutely despicable. They take these Turkish reports at face value. You cannot do this. It's a false flag. I would recommend to people, if you have occasion to discuss these matters, make a careful note of that bombing that went on in Ankara on Wednesday of this past week. That is a classic case of a false flag event, right? Set up by the Turkish MIT, but then blamed on the Kurds, right? And there's even a person involved, right? Maybe a dupe, a double agent, or whatever, right? Probably a dupe or some fanatic, right? Who thought he was headed for an eternal reward. It couldn't be more blatant. It couldn't be more made to order than it turned out to be. So make a note of it. But above all, don't believe these media reports. And above all, don't give any credence to Mad Dog Erdogan, because this is way too much. And he's insolent, and he's insulting the United States. He's giving orders. No. This will not do. So, I think that is at least a reasonable overview. Now, again, we're waiting for news from the UN Security Council acting on the Russian request. The specifics of the accusation coming from Erdogan is he claims that there's a faction of the PKK called the TAK And he says those are specifically the ones who did it. And in the same speech, Erdogan said, Obama, we expect you to dump the YPG. This would be a double win, right? Because the YPG are wiping out his puppets. So he would get off the hook in a couple of ways. So, for the coming week, Azaz, right? We want to see the Kurds taking over Azaz. And with that, you'll see that there are really two roads that go through this Jarablus corridor, right? There's the road that goes through Jarablus in the east, and then there's this road that goes through Azaz in the west. Now, there are other smaller roads that could be used in the middle, but the funny thing about the corridor is there's one road on the east side, one road on the west side, and no comparable roads as far as I can see from the maps anyway, in the middle. So we've got to close that corridor. Now, I also have to comment on Madame Merkel. Oh, my God. This is now a Calvary. This poor woman, this is a strategic moron of the first rank. In other words, all she can see is that she thinks she has a deal with Erdogan to keep refugees in Turkey. But she can't see that this is going to blow her up politically before she knows it. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, poor Madame Merkel, all she can see is that there are maybe 2 million refugees that are being kept in Turkey and prevented from coming into Europe and headed for Germany, of course. Merkel is now very much weakened politically as a result of her really her failure to understand that the way out of this is to put an end to the Syrian civil war. And you're going to have to challenge Turkey, and you're going to have to challenge the neocons, and you're going to have to challenge the British and the French. Yeah. But on the other hand, you could give a push to the U.S.-Russian vague cooperation, let's say. But that's very much worthwhile. So Merkel comes out and says that it would be helpful to have a no-fly zone and a safe haven for terrorists, of course. And it just so happens that the no-fly zone and the safe haven for terrorists is precisely, as always, the Jarablus corridor, Jarablus to Efren. That area there is going to be carved out, and it means that you can't then it becomes much harder to interdict the supply lines. You can't cut the supply lines anywhere near as easily if you've got, 100 kilometers or 100 miles of Syrian territory that's being carved away. So this is really dumb. Merkel would be much better advised to send the Bundeswehr. I heard that there's been German rearmament. It's about 1955. German rearmament in the mid-50s. So it's 60 years ago and 6 decades. And that entity, the Bundeswehr, there's also a Bundesmarine, there's a German Navy, there's a German Army, there's a Luftwaffe, there's an Air Force. They would be more than able to go in there and close that Jarablus corridor. Once you do that, the Syrian civil war comes to an end, and every Syrian, many of them anyway, will turn around and head back towards Damascus, Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, Hama, and these other cities. But this poor woman can't see it. So I think politically she is in very bad shape. She deserves to be. And what she's recommending is absolutely destructive. All right. Now, we have word today that the U.S. has bombed positions of top terrorists, I guess it's ISIS and some others, near the area of Tripoli, Libya. This, I guess it's not the first time, and I guess there's not a whole lot to say about it, except you got to remember how that happened, right? Just for people who want to subscribe to a Manichaean view, right, that there's absolute good on one side, absolute evil on the other. Remember, the only way that Libyan attack could have happened 5 years ago was that Russia, under Medvedev, failed to pose a veto in the Security Council, which they could have done and they should have done. Instead, they relied on idiotic assurances from the Western powers. This is very unwise. You'll remember that the Russian ambassador to Libya, Chamov, Chamov, I think it comes across transliterated, had some very rough words to Medvedev. He said, Medvedev, you're a traitor. Remember, you shouldn't have done that. Libya was a good ally, and they would have been quite so. So it takes a lot of, what can we say, mistakes to allow some of these things to happen. So if you're going to tell the story of Libya, that's another key part, because there are a lot of powers, a lot of European countries that are forbidden in their own laws and their own constitutions. They can't take part in military actions unless it's approved by the UN Security Council. So that Russian veto would have made a very, very big difference. And we hope that this lesson has been learned. The Saudis, by the way, are saying that the Syrian rebels need to acquire some really good surface-to-air missiles. So that's going to be interesting to see if the Saudis deliver on those, because most likely those are going to be U.S. missiles, and the end-user certificate is supposed to be that the Saudis are the end users and not some terrorist group in northern Syria. All right. Pardon me. We've had another snowstorm here in Washington this past week. Now let's just look at a couple of things briefly in the international realm. The United Kingdom under Cameron is attempting to haggle a special deal for themselves, and this is amazing, right? General de Gaulle of France had said no to the British entry in the early late 60s and early 70s, right? De Gaulle had no. And he was right that the British would always be a Trojan horse for somebody. And it was, for a long time, it was considered Trojan horse for the United States. But now, what the British are demanding is that they be exempted from the financial regulations of the European Union. And that, of course, includes, there is a certain kind of Wall Street sales tax, a very limited one, but some kind of a tax on speculative turnover is operative in a number. Italy and some other European countries, continental, have it. But what you have to look at now is the British threatening to leave the European Union. What is that? That is the British-Chinese alliance. That is this thing that was put together during the visit of President Xi and Prime Minister Li, I guess back in the middle of October, around the 15th of October. We had this, hugely important visit by President Xi to the British oligarchy, and they have made common cause. So it's Perfide Albion. Perfide Albion knows that in general they cannot survive unless they're allowed to parasitize the continental European economies, right? Because the British apparently have the third largest economy after Britain, after Germany and France. But of course, that's all derivatives. That's the City of London. That's financial services. Those used to be the invisible earnings. Now they're very visible, and what we see is obscene. So Cameron says he's battling for Britain. This reminded me of bundles for Britain. But the bundles for Britain these days are coming from China. So what's up with this stuff? And what's up with the Chinese in the South China Sea? This is a grab of territory. The basis of U.S. diplomacy, especially in the 19th century, was the freedom of the seas. And even the Venetians used to demand the freedom of the seas, right? That this was the habit of the world from time immemorial, was that they were the freedom of the seas. Now, if you start fortifying these little islands in disputed territory, these are unfriendly acts. And I think it would be reasonable to think of methods of economic self-defense, in particular for the United States, and that is the 15% protective tariff. We're going to be talking a little bit later on about Apple, a sinister company, I would say, the classic exploiter. But Apple is what? Apple is a Chinese company. Let's not kid ourselves. They have some executives sitting around in Seattle or California or someplace. Apple is a Chinese company, so we don't like that. And therefore, 15% protective tariff would help in so many ways, and Apple would have to bring it, not even bring back, but for the first time, set up its factories here. Back in a minute. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and now we are delighted and honored to be able to bring you a direct report from Damascus, Syria. And this is our good friend Thierry Maison. Thierry is the founder and principal personality of the Voltaire Network, Réseau Voltaire, which is always a good place to look if you're interested, especially in the Middle East and other security, international strategic questions. And he's the only Western journalist who has remained in Damascus in Syria during the entire time for the last 5 years since the hostilities started. So I know Thierry has a couple of things he wants to explain. Maybe we should start, first of all, with the Munich conference on Syria. Now, this is the one featuring Kerry and Lavrov announcing a joint intent to go forward to a kind of ceasefire in the Syrian civil war. And then right on the heels of Munich, we had this Munich Security Conference, right? The Wehrkunde meeting with Medvedev and many others. So Thierry, welcome.
Hello, Webster. Yes, we'll talk first about this Munich conference with what we call the Diana Group, because it's the first time we meet in Vienna, now in Munich. And this group is composed with the main states involved in the Syrian conflict, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. So, when they meet in Munich, the Russian and the United States together, they impose to change the way to negotiate about Syria. Until now, all the negotiations were under the responsibility of the United Nations, especially, of course, of Jeffrey Feltman, the guy from Hillary Clinton, who is always driving all the warmongers in the Middle East. Right now, Kerry and Lavrov together imposed to change these things, and they created two groups, one about humanitarian issues, and the second one about the cessation of hostilities. Both of those groups will be co-chaired by the U.S. and Russia, and the United Nations will be only the secretary of this group without any power of initiative. So it means that Kerry and Lavrov together, they subtract the file from the hands of Jeffrey Feltman. This is very, very important, but it is not a victory right now. That's only the beginning, because you have to remember that each time that Jeffrey Feltman loses a little power, immediately after that, he launched a new attack on another side. Mm-hmm. So, there's two groups. The first one was about humanitarian issues. You have to remember that during the last weeks, there was an agreement about that topic, and the Damascus government signed this agreement, but not the opposition. So in fact, when now we say there is a solution on the humanitarian issue, it means only that the opposition change its position, not the Damascus government who already accept this. And the second group was about cessation of hostilities. This is different from the idea of a ceasefire, because cessation of hostilities means we stop to fight together, but ceasefire is a low term with low consequences. The cessation of hostilities is not only for the two camps, the government and the opposition, but also for all the people involved in Syria, and especially for Russia. So, when they say that in the next days they will find a way to go to this cessation of hostilities, probably for the first March, this means that the Russian must stop to bomb the Syrian opposition. But in the final declaration of the Munich meeting, it is said that the cessation of hostilities doesn't concern the jihadi groups from Al-Qaeda and Daesh. And this will give
ISIS and other terrorists coming from Turkey. Right? Okay. Thierry.
Okay. So, after the meeting of the Vienna group was this annual conference on the Bertelsmann Group in Bertelsmann Foundation in Munich. This conference is annual and organized for NATO with 600 people, leaders from different countries, especially from Europe, of course, but also from other countries in the world. And during this annual conference, it was planned that Russia and the US will explain what they have decided with the meeting about Syria. Of course, they explain, but at the same time, you have a lot of people who are always warmongers, like John McCain or like the foreign minister for Germany, Steinmeier. So there's people who try to always at war and were asking about the sincerity of Russia, always saying that Russia invaded Crimea and now is expanding his power in Syria and so on. What is important in this conference is that, in fact, Kerry and Lavrov always seems to be allied against this group, and were explaining what they want to do in Syria. They want to go lengthily to peace. So, but there was something that nobody in this audience was knowing, is that just before the conference, Russia sent to the members of a Security Council in the United Nations a secret report about Turkey.
Okay, hang on, Thierry. We're going to have a station break, and we'll be right back to hear about that very important report on Turkish support for terrorism. Back in a couple of seconds on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, and we're on the telephone with Thierry Maison from Damascus, Syria. Thierry, of course, the head of the Voltaire Network and we're just about to get the details of the Russian intelligence report detailing Turkish support for terrorism that was apparently dropped on the Munich Security Conference, the old Wehrkunde series, just a couple of weeks ago. So, Thierry, please continue.
So this report from, we don't know exactly in Russia was writing this report. It was, of course, sent with the authorization of the Kremlin, but we don't know if it is from the FSB or for the military intelligence or for all the Russian services. We don't know. But this is a 2-page report, totally incredible, with 10 facts about Turkey. That's very hard accusations of links of support to send weapons and especially to train the members of Al-Qaeda and the members of Daesh. And all these accusations are with the dates, the places, and all these things are during the last year. So when you read that, you understand that if all this is real, Turkey must be sanctioned immediately by United Nations under the Chapter 7 of the Charter. I mean, with the use of force, because Turkey is an obvious responsible for all the terrorist crimes in the Middle East now. Normally, the Security Council must ask evidences to Russia. They must ask to Turkey explanations, and after that they have to take sanctions. And not only United Nations, but also NATO, and also the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the European Union have to stop immediately the negotiation with Turkey. Of course, this will not happen, because when you read these things, you understand that if the Security Council was discussing that, it will open a lot of other files. Because, for example, you had a part about the fact that last year 1,000 of Libyan members of Al-Qaeda were sent from Libya to Turkey, and with the help of the Turkish secret services, they will be transported to Daesh in Syria. But according to the Russian, the guy who was the head of this group was Mahdi al-Arati. Mahdi al-Arati is both from Libya and from Ireland. He was member of the Flotilla of Freedom, who in 2008 tried to go to Gaza and was arrested by the Israeli army. Right. At that time, he was wounded like a lot of other militants in this flotilla. And when he arrived back in Turkey, he was received by the Prime Minister, who go in the hospital and so on. Okay. So that guy has a long story with Turkey. But he is known also to be paid by the CIA, because his house in Ireland was, there was an attack in his house, and the police discovered that he had 200,000 euros with him that he received from the CIA to organize something against Muammar Gaddafi. The same guy, Mahdi al-Arati, was responsible of the Al-Qaeda group who tried to take the Rixos Hotel when Tripoli was attacked by NATO, I was at that time in the Rixos Hotel. And in the underground of the Rixos Hotel was the Gaddafi family.
Right.
And that guy was the leader of the Al-Qaeda group who attacked the hotel, and he had the support of the French Foreign Legion, who was member of his group of Al-Qaeda. It was the first time I see the French army involved in the Al-Qaeda groups in the Middle East. So that Mahdi al-Arati was elected after that mayor of Tripoli. But we know that in November 2011, goes with a first group of Libyan members of Al-Qaeda to create in Syria the Free Syrian Army, which is, of course, without Syrian people, but only with foreign people.
Foreigners.
And, yes. And so now we learn that he come again in Syria to help to reinforce Daesh with new fighters from Libya. So when you see that, if you begin to search about that guy, you will discover all the links between Al-Qaeda, Turkey, France, United States. You will see all these people working together, both in Libya and in Syria. So this is a small example, but you have 10 facts like that inside this report. It is clear that never the Security Council will discuss that. So certainly, you have now some negotiations, secret negotiation about Turkey, and Russia and the United States have to decide now what they will do with President Erdogan. At the same time, you heard the Turkish government saying he will attack military Syria in the next weeks. But of course, this is only a way to disturb the things. This is only a way for Turkey to escape from the consequences of what they have done before. So,
okay, Thierry, that is fascinating.
The next week.
And we will try to focus public attention on this very interesting Russian report. And we have, by the way, I hope you saw, we had a demonstration at the United Nations for the ouster, the firing of Feltman. So it all adds up. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the coming weeks, and we'll be right back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in a snowy Washington, D.C. Now, we have two things left to talk about, two big themes, I would say. One is the question of Apple and a certain Tim Cook. But let's say a few words about Antonin Scalia, who went to his eternal reward a week ago, Saturday. And naturally, we, that is to say the Tax Wall Street Party and your correspondent here, were very severe critics of Scalia. Scalia was the key person in what we called the Rats Cabal, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia, and given the bombastic exertions of Scalia writing these polemical and, often very strange legal opinions, they often managed to pull in Justice Kennedy, another Reagan appointee, and therefore impose elements of barbarism on the United States. Scalia is certainly, the first thing that you have to understand about Scalia, he is not in any sense a conservative. He's the opposite of a conservative. He is a right-wing radical, a right-wing extremist who doesn't want to conserve anything. He's not a traditionalist. He's not interested in U.S. traditions, as he says himself. He's interested in, first of all, originalism, That is, he wants to know what certain, or he claims to want to know, what certain features of law were understood to mean back around 1800 or 10 years or 20 years before that. So in other words, it's I always call it the dead hand of the past. And you'll hear these people like Rubio this past week saying the Constitution is not a living, breathing document. It is somehow an inherited straitjacket. It is somehow a dead hand of the past, throttling the throats of the living. And this is pretty much what Scalia did. Now, of course, with Scalia, there's always a huge element of bad faith, because he claims to want to discover the common understanding of certain legal provisions at the time they were enacted, right, in the 18th century, primarily. But, of course, the bad faith is he doesn't really want to know that. He wants to go back and look for plausible cover stories so that he can enact unprecedented barbarism. In other words, he is not a stare decisis judge. He's not interested in precedents, really. He's interested in judicial activism. And that's, they all say, what a contradiction. He screamed about judicial activism, and he was the biggest judicial activist. And of course, when it was his majority, it was always on the barbaric, plutocratic, reactionary, right-wing extremist, and really shocking barbarism that he exemplified, coming from this past, right, that he was a creature of Reagan and a creature of Edwin Meese with his Adam Smith tie, as if Adam Smith had anything to do with the United States. Adam Smith was on the enemy side in the American Revolution. Adam Smith is not a benefactor of the United States. Scalia, as I've said, is a mentality, is pretty much Francisco Franco of Spain, the caudillo, and Marshal Pétain of the Vichy puppet state in France. You could even take Scalia all the way back to reactionary Catholics, somebody like Pius IX. Well, Pius IX, especially after he'd gone off the deep end, after the killing of Pellegrino Rossi, which we can understand up to a certain point, but we have to condemn it no matter what. Remember that Pius IX was pro-Confederate, and Scalia pro-Confederate on most of his decisions. And I think the main thing is he gravitated to the side of evil. For example, you go back to decisions on torture. He's in favor of torture. He voted for torture. Guantanamo Bay, concentration camp for terrorists, Scalia is all for it. I can't get over myself, this Hobby Lobby. This, to me, is an unbelievable balancing act. I think what we can say here is that the late months, the last months and years of Scalia's term on the Supreme Court have produced some of the most monstrous abortions and miscarriages of justice that we've ever seen, right, as he became more and more, I guess, blatant in what he was doing. Hobby Lobby says that if the boss doesn't like abortion and claims to have a religious basis for it, right, maybe he's worshiping Baal or Baphomet or something like this, then the boss gets to impose that on you. And I wonder, how about transfusions? How about vaccinations? Does the boss get to decide on those if he doesn't like them? We'll see. I'm sure we'll see those things before too long. So Hobby Lobby says if the boss condemns it with religious reasons, then the poor little workies, the little employees, they have to kowtow to what the boss wants. And if his decision is the insurance policy won't pay for abortion, then it won't, and you're up the creek, right, or some other thing that he doesn't like. And, of course, the big one is the Bush versus Gore in the year 2000. Now, this is a real achievement to actually have a coup d'etat, a putsch, from the bench of the Supreme Court. That is what Scalia and his co-thinkers in this faction that he assembled around himself, giving his bombastic and other methods. Remember, he was a founder of this monstrous Federalist Society, right? This is the society of reactionary judges and worse. And with that, he was able to essentially throw away his entire theoretical scaffolding. Scalia had said states' rights, states' rights, states' rights, as long as it was the reactionary thing to do. But then when it got to be Bush versus Gore, he said, forget about states' rights. We're the Supreme Court, and we're going to stop that vote count, because otherwise that's going to damage candidate George W. Bush. So if you didn't like the Afghan war, if you didn't like 9/11, because as has been pointed out, whatever else you can say about 9/11, and I've said plenty, see my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, the 9/11 occurred on Bush's watch. It happened on Bush's watch. And if the buck stops in the Oval Office, it stops with Bush, clearly enough. We don't need any windbags from Jamaica, Queens to tell us this stuff. But the thing then is, if Scalia is the key man in installing G.W. Bush, which he was, then the Afghan war and above all the Iraq war go on Scalia's war guilt account, and that gets him up there, right? He's participating in several million deaths. I'd say about 2 million altogether between Afghanistan and Iraq. So that's a really big one. And we can go on, right? He's got any number of monstrous decisions. So remember, originalism is one side of it, but then when you really get him, he's a nominalist. In other words, he calls himself a textualist. Textualist. Now, a conservative would be interested, for example, in arguing natural law. Natural law helps you to construe what the Constitution says. In other words, textualism is bankrupt. You need natural law. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So just to sum up the Scalia question, natural law is indispensable in construing what the words mean in your stupid nominalist textualist approach. You can't get along without natural law. To many, this sounds like a heresy. Both leftist and rightist extremists won't like this one. But you need natural law. In other words, there's got to be a notion of equity. There's got to be a notion of fairness. Above all, there's got to be a notion that without scientific and technological progress, any society will tend to collapse. Scientific knowledge is the basis of the modern state, and you have to pursue it. So there are values that you've got to realize, and they are things like the general welfare, right? And the promotion of scientific discovery and the protection of that process. Right? So not only torture, Guantanamo, and other forms of barbarism. Now, what should Obama do? Obama should make a recess appointment right now. If you go back, Earl Warren was the most influential justice of the 20th century. That's Brown versus Board of Education. He was the governor of California, appointed by Eisenhower, by Ike. 1953, he was appointed and then confirmed the next year. Went on to be the most influential Chief Justice, and thank God he was not as bad as Scalia. And then then Associate Justice Brennan was named in 1956 and then confirmed within a couple of months. What should Obama do today? He should do before Monday, because apparently that will be the end of any opportunity. Obama should name a black woman. A black woman, because we want to destroy the Republican Party. If they're going to block any and all judges, then let it be a black woman. They'll offend women and they'll offend the black community, and they will therefore come out and vote to smash the Republicans in November. That's just elementary. So a black woman. Now, they say that Loretta Lynch only got 52 votes. Maybe somebody else is a somewhat better bet, right? Somebody who's been serving on a federal court, maybe a federal court of appeals. We'll see. Obama, fight. Don't wimp out again, right? Don't be bipartisan again. a recess appointment on this weekend, today, that is Saturday, the 20th of February, and make that appointment. Now, here's the other one that we want to go through. Tim Cook of Apple says that he will refuse to honor a legitimate writ, a subpoena, in effect, from a federal magistrate telling him to open up the iPhone 5 of this character Syed Farook, the late Syed Farook, one of the killers or patsies in the San Bernardino shootings. So the San Bernardino massacre, just so you remember, 14 dead. I'd like to go to the 14 families of these dead victims and say, what do you think? Should Apple have to comply with a legitimate court order? Now remember, some people say we don't like blanket, sucking up all information. That's not what this is. This is a very specific court order coming from a United States federal magistrate in a murder case, and in a multiple murder case, a mass murder case, which is still under investigation. And we're even told that the FBI has still not completely eliminated the possibility that there was a third shooter. Now, if there was a third shooter, don't we want to look inside this guy's phone and see what his cable traffic was and phone calls to somebody who might have been a third shooter? Now, this guy Cook, right, Apple, sweatshops, runaway shops in China, okay? Contempt for American workers. There are no tool and die people left in the United States. You can put all the tool and die people into one room, whereas in China you need a football field. Wait a minute, Cook. That just means it's up to you to do your part. As I said before, Apple is a Chinese company. Let's face it. So here's a Chinese company that won't respect U.S. law. Well, that's no good. Cook should be jailed immediately. Jail Cook for contempt of court. And he's now got these other people, Sundar Pichai. I have to admit, I don't know what the relationship of Sundar Pichai, the head of Google, to the United States is. But we also got this guy on Twitter, the head of that, Dorsey, is also supporting the position. Now, this is a question of neo-feudalism, okay? Either you have a government of laws, and in that case, court orders have to be respected, and we cannot have powerful private interests simply defying the legally constituted authority. This is parallel, by the way, to Cloven Bundy and Ammon Bundy and this gang of Mormons. This is now the Silicon Valley feudal oligarchs are fighting the modern state. And, this will not work. We're told that under the banner of encryption, we've got the let's see who they are. These two brothers from Russia, the Durov brothers, right? The Durie, right? I think that means they're not that smart. The Durov brothers, Samaduri, they're people who fled from Putin. They're now in Germany, and they're saying that, they don't want to be probed. They have something called Telegram, which is implicated in the Paris attacks of the 13th of November, operating out of Germany. And we're now told that the jihadis of the world have a fad going. They use Telegram because it's got 2 layers of encryption. And with that, ISIS can send announcements and it can recruit people in the Western world, if this is all technically accurate. So the troubling precedent is that somebody thinks they're above the law. And Obama is weak, and Loretta Lynch is weak on this stuff. We needed Cloven Bundy jailed in April or May of 2015, and instead we had to wait now until a kind of a spin-off from the Oregon events. So the iPhone 5, that's the other thing to be said about that, is if there's no way for the iPhone 5 to be forced to comply with a subpoena or a lawful court order, then it should not be marketed in the United States. And it would say, look, you're not allowed to sell that in the United States. And if you do, it's going to be confiscated and you're going to be punished because you simply cannot have this. And think of all the things you might find. You might find the exchanges between Syed Farouk and his FBI handlers, his patsy tenders, and so on down the line. So I think this is a pretty clear example, and we could go on, right? It's a terrorist murder investigation. Right? Now, obviously we know, right? Nobody knows better than I do about patsies and moles and how they interact and technicians. That could have been the third one. But that's all the more reason to get the contents of this phone. Whether this is a problem for the brand name, the reputation, and the marketing strategy of Apple, we don't care about that. This is now a very rough world, and we cannot have the chaos of every large corporation deciding that they get to decide what laws apply to them and which ones not. They have exported the jobs were never even here. It never occurred to them to create jobs in the United States. It's all in China, and Apple is hoarding hundreds of millions or billions in cash, multiple billions, in its various overseas bank accounts. So this is a bad corporate citizen, and they have got to be slammed. Jail Tim Cook for contempt of court. And we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio.